The millionaire CEO thought she only wanted his money, until he saw her with two little girls who had his eyes. Nathan Brooks had always believed that success meant never letting anyone close enough to disappoint him. From the outside, he looked like the perfect image of control, a man with thick brown curls that fell neatly into place and blue eyes so cold they seemed carved from glass. He had built his empire with ruthless discipline, and he told himself every night that the price of that triumph was worth it. When he married Emily, he thought he was making an exception that wouldn't cost him anything. She was warm where he was cool, patient where he was impatient, and she had a smile that made other people trust her instantly. At first, he convinced himself he trusted her too, or at least enough to imagine they were building something real together. But as the years passed and his wealth multiplied, something in him began to corrode, a quiet suspicion he couldn't shake no matter how much he tried to pretend. He started to notice every small thing she did as if it were evidence of her hidden motives. When she suggested he take a weekend away from the office, he heard manipulation. When she worried about how much time he spent at work, he heard judgment. When she said she missed him, he heard accusation. The worst part was that she never argued back. She only looked at him with that same tired gentleness, as though she knew he was fighting something that had nothing to do with her but couldn't figure out how to stop. The night everything ended, he came home later than usual, still keyed up from a negotiation that had turned ugly. Emily was sitting in the living room wearing a simple black dress, her straight brown hair falling around her shoulders. She looked up as he entered, and for a moment he almost felt relief just seeing her there, waiting for him. But then she asked quietly if they could talk, and the thin rope of his patience finally snapped. He didn't remember every word he said, only the way her face grew paler with each accusation. He accused her of marrying him because she knew he would be rich, of staying because she liked the life he provided, of never loving him at all. He heard himself say those things and some small part of him recoiled, but he couldn't stop. He needed to push her away so he wouldn't have to face the possibility that she had loved him more honestly than he deserved. When she finally stood, her hands folded in front of her as though she was holding herself together by force, he felt something like victory. It made him sick even as it filled the empty space inside him. "I don't know what you think you're proving," she said, her voice so low he almost didn't hear it over the thudding in his head. "But you're wrong. About everything." He didn't answer. He couldn't. She watched him for a moment longer, and in her eyes he saw a grief so profound it felt like an accusation sharper than any words. Then she turned and walked out of the room. He heard her packing, the sound of a suitcase zipper closing, the soft click of the front door. Nathan stood alone in the hallway long after she was gone, the silence echoing around him. He told himself she would come back, that she would realize she had no reason to leave, but even as he thought it, he knew it was a lie. Because somewhere deep down, he had known all along that she hadn't cared about his money. And now, it was too late to take any of it back. In the weeks that followed, Nathan kept expecting something to happen that would prove he had been right all along. He waited for the call from an attorney demanding a settlement or a message from Emily asking for money she claimed she was owed. But none came. The days stretched into a cold, hollow routine that felt both familiar and unbearable. He would wake up in the cavernous bedroom that still smelled faintly of her shampoo, shower in silence, and drive himself to the office long before anyone else arrived. No one dared to ask where Emily had gone. His employees treated him with the same wary respect they always had, but he noticed how they avoided meeting his eyes, as if they could feel that something vital in him had cracked. At night he would return to the house that was now too quiet, walk past the empty chair where she used to read, and tell himself he preferred it this way. He repeated that lie so often it started to sound like truth. When he couldn't sleep, which was most nights, he found himself pacing the living room, replaying the last conversation in his mind. He remembered the way her voice trembled when she said he was wrong, and he hated that part of him still wanted to believe her. Eventually, he hired someone to find out where she had gone, not because he planned to confront her, but because he needed confirmation that she was living exactly the life he had accused her of wanting. The investigator returned with a thin report that contained none of what he had imagined. There were no expensive hotels, no new lover with deeper pockets, no lavish spending. Just a modest apartment in a town he had never bothered to visit, a part-time job at a small bakery, and a note that she had been seen carrying 2 infants. Nathan read that detail over and over until the words blurred. 2 infants. It took longer than it should have for the meaning to settle in his chest, and when it did, he felt like the walls of the study were closing in. He tried to convince himself that she must have met someone else. It was easier to believe that than to imagine she had been pregnant when she left him and hadn't told him. Easier to cling to the old story that she was deceitful and selfish, that he was better off without her. But the part of him that remembered how her hands had trembled on her belly some nights when she thought he wasn't looking knew the truth. He didn't try to contact her. He couldn't. What would he say? That he had ruined everything because he was too afraid to believe she might love him without conditions. That he had thrown her away at the moment she had needed him most. He folded the report neatly, set it in the bottom drawer of his desk, and told himself that there was nothing to be done now. And yet, every morning, he woke up thinking about her. Wondering what their daughters, because he knew, in his bones, they were his daughters, looked like. If they laughed like she did or had inherited his eyes. If they asked about the father they had never met. Those questions grew heavier as the seasons turned. He tried to bury himself in work, but the satisfaction he once found in achievement felt paper-thin. Late at night, he would sometimes walk into the empty nursery they had never finished. He would stand by the window, hands in his pockets, and stare into the darkness beyond the glass. He had thought the worst thing that could happen to a man like him was to be used for his wealth. But the truth was simpler and far crueler. The worst thing was realizing that he had been loved purely, and he had destroyed it with his own fear. Nathan had built his life around never second-guessing his choices. Every major decision he made in business was precise, immediate, final. But the knowledge that he might have children he had never met turned even the simplest moment into a quiet trial he could not escape. He found himself lingering over small things he had once ignored, a father crouched in a park tying a little girl's shoes, a woman lifting her toddler into a car seat, the bright ringing laughter of children he passed on the sidewalk. Each time it felt like a tiny blade twisting in the hollow he tried to pretend wasn't there. He didn't tell anyone what he had learned. Not his lawyer, not his oldest friend, not even his assistant, who had worked beside him for nearly a decade and could read every flicker of his moods. Instead, he carried the truth like a hidden bruise, something that hurt worse the more he tried not to touch it. He told himself he was giving Emily space, that it was better not to intrude on her life when he had forfeited any claim to it the day he accused her of betrayal. But he also knew that was only part of the reason he stayed away. The other part was simpler, he was afraid of what he would find if he showed up. Afraid he would see confirmation of everything he feared about himself. That he was a man incapable of loving anyone the way they deserved. He tried to convince himself he was too busy to think about it. The company was expanding again, a new set of negotiations pulling him back into the familiar rhythms of work. But no amount of strategic planning could keep the memories from slipping in around the edges of his focus. Sometimes he would be sitting in a conference room listening to a presentation and suddenly remember the first time Emily had fallen asleep with her head on his shoulder. He would remember the way she looked at him when she was still sure they were building something lasting. He would remember how she had never once asked him for anything except his presence, and how that simple request had felt too enormous to grant. The nights were worse than the days. He had never liked going home before, but now the silence felt unbearable. He couldn't look at the kitchen without seeing her standing by the stove in her bare feet, or at the hallway without imagining her slipping quietly past with her hair loose around her shoulders. He found excuses to stay late at the office, not because he had pressing work but because it delayed the moment he would have to confront the reality he had created. And then, one afternoon, he found himself in the elevator staring at his reflection in the polished metal doors. He looked exactly the way he always did, impeccable suit, steady gaze, expression carefully neutral. But something had shifted in him so fundamentally that he no longer recognized the man he was pretending to be. He thought of Emily's face when she told him he was wrong about everything. He thought of the report folded in his desk drawer. He thought of two little girls who didn't know their father existed. For the first time, the weight of that knowledge became too heavy to bear alone. He walked out of the building without telling anyone where he was going. He didn't stop to think through the consequences. He only knew that if he didn't see them for himself, if he didn't look into their eyes and face the truth, he would never be able to live with the man he had become. The drive to that small town felt endless. Every mile was a silent recitation of everything he had done wrong. He tried to prepare himself for whatever he would find, for Emily slamming the door in his face, for the children turning away from him, for the certainty that he could never deserve their forgiveness. He told himself he was only going to see them, nothing more, that he wouldn't ask for anything she wasn't willing to give. But underneath all his rehearsed restraint was something simpler and more desperate. He needed to know if it was still possible to be part of something that mattered. When he finally parked on a quiet street lined with narrow trees and modest houses, his hands were shaking so badly he had to grip the steering wheel just to steady them. He sat there for a long time, listening to the ticking engine and the distant sounds of children playing somewhere out of sight. He wondered if their laughter belonged to his daughters. He wondered if he would recognize them by more than just the color of their eyes. And when he stepped out of the car, he knew that no matter how much it cost him, he couldn't leave without trying to face what he had left behind. Nathan stood on the sidewalk longer than he could justify to himself, staring at the narrow row of houses as if expecting someone to step outside and end the uncertainty for him. He had never been afraid of walking into a boardroom filled with men twice his age, never hesitated to make a deal that would change hundreds of lives, but now he felt like a child on the edge of something he didn't understand. The house he had been given the address for looked small and plain, with a cracked walkway and a few potted plants lined up on the steps. There was nothing about it that matched the stories he used to tell himself about Emily's ambitions. It looked like the home of someone who had chosen quiet over spectacle, someone who wanted to build something real even when it wasn't easy. He took a slow breath and stepped up to the door, but before he could knock, he heard laughter from the side of the house. It was a sound so bright and pure that it sliced through the tight ache in his chest. He followed the sound around the corner and stopped so suddenly he almost lost his balance. There, sitting on a blanket laid out over patchy grass, was Emily. Her hair was pulled back in a loose braid, her face turned to the sun, and in her lap, one of the little girls was giggling as she tried to reach for a bubble floating just out of her grasp. Another child sat beside her, clapping chubby hands with delight each time the bubbles drifted close. He couldn't move. He couldn't even swallow. The two girls were small and soft-limbed, their curls catching the late afternoon light in a way that made his breath stop. One of them turned her head toward him, and for an instant, he saw his own blue eyes looking back. It was so unmistakable that he felt something in his chest crack open in a way that was almost physical. Emily didn't see him at first. She was too busy wiping a smear of soap from the nearest girl's cheek. It struck him how effortless she looked, how completely absorbed she was in the simple moment. There was no bitterness in her expression, no sign of the anger he had always expected to find in her if he ever saw her again. It was somehow worse than if she had looked at him with hate. Because it meant she had learned to live without him. When she finally glanced up and saw him standing there, the world seemed to hold its breath. Her hands stilled, her smile faded, and for a moment, she just stared. He tried to find words, but none came. The only thing he could manage was to lift a hand in a small, helpless gesture that felt inadequate for everything he was carrying. She didn't speak right away. She shifted the little girl off her lap and rose slowly, brushing grass from the knees of her black dress. He saw her take in his suit, the polished shoes, the way he was standing as if he were afraid to get too close. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and careful, like she was afraid any sudden movement might shatter the fragile space between them. "What are you doing here?" she asked. He swallowed, feeling his throat close around the words. I needed to see you," he said. "To see them." Her gaze moved to the girls, who were both staring up at him with wide, curious eyes. He saw her gather herself before she answered. "You have no right to just appear," she said quietly. Not after everything. He nodded because there was no defense, nothing he could offer that would make her believe he had any claim to this life she had built without him. I know, he said. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to let me in. I needed to know if they were real. Emily's face changed then, something softening and breaking all at once. They're real, she said, her voice catching. They're as real as it gets. One of the girls took a tentative step toward him, her small hands balled at her sides. He didn't dare move. She was so small, impossibly small, and he felt a wave of regret so enormous it nearly buckled his knees. He wondered how many first steps he had missed, how many nights she had cried for a father who wasn't there. Emily glanced down at her daughters and then back at him. She looked like she was weighing something heavy in her mind. You should go, she said finally, though her voice was softer than before. This isn't the place for this. He nodded again. He couldn't argue. But before he turned to leave, he forced himself to look her in the eye. I'm sorry, he said, and he meant it more than he had meant anything in his life. I am so sorry. Then he took a step back, and another, until he was at the edge of the yard, the grass giving way to the cracked sidewalk. He watched as Emily knelt to gather the girls back into her arms, watched as she held them close as if to reassure them everything was fine. Only when she looked up again and met his gaze for the last time did he let himself turn away. He walked back to his car feeling like he had left a piece of himself behind, something he might never be able to reclaim. Nathan did not remember much about the drive home. The streets blurred into one another, washed out by the raw ache in his chest. By the time he pulled into his garage, the sky had darkened, but he felt as if no time had passed at all. He sat in the car long after he killed the engine, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing holding him upright. In all the scenarios he had imagined, seeing Emily again had always been something explosive, a confrontation, a reckoning, something he could fight his way through. But what he found instead was worse, a quiet, undeniable proof that life had gone on without him. It was not anger that had met him there in that yard. It was acceptance. And he realized that was what hurt most of all. Inside the house, everything was exactly as he had left it, and he hated that. He hated that he could walk into the kitchen without tripping over a toy, that the living room was spotless and still, that he could spend an entire evening without hearing the small voices that should have been calling him daddy. He poured himself a glass of water and stood at the counter, replaying every second he had stood there watching Emily cradle the girls in her arms. He tried to imagine what she had felt when she saw him, what she must have thought of him standing there in his expensive suit like a ghost she'd already buried. He tried to imagine what the girls saw, a stranger with their eyes, and the thought of it nearly undid him. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, remembering the tentative step one of the girls had taken toward him before Emily told him to leave. He could not stop wondering if she had done that because some part of her recognized him, or simply because she was too young to know she should be afraid. He thought about all the things he had missed, their first words, their first steps, their first birthdays. He tried to picture what their voices sounded like when they cried, if they asked for their mother in the dark or if they already knew how to comfort themselves because no one else was coming. At dawn he got up and walked through the house, room by room, trying to find any trace of who he had been before he let fear and suspicion turn him into a man he barely recognized. In the spare bedroom, where Emily had once suggested they make space for a nursery, the walls were still the same dull cream color, bare and cold. He stood there until the sun climbed high enough to spill light across the floor, feeling something inside him settle into a terrible clarity. He could not undo what he had done. He could not buy back the time he had wasted. But he also knew he could not go on pretending that none of it mattered. Later that morning he called his assistant and cleared his schedule without offering an explanation. He sat down at the kitchen table and tried to write a letter to Emily. He started it over a dozen times, every attempt dissolving into something that sounded either defensive or pitiful. Finally he pushed the paper aside and pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes, breathing in slow, ragged gulps of air. There were no words that could make this right. Only actions. And he understood, maybe for the first time, that he would have to earn the right to even stand in the same room with them again. He thought about what Emily had said before she told him to go. This isn't the place for this. She had been right. He could not appear out of nowhere, demanding answers or absolution. He had to start with the simplest truth, that he was sorry, and that he was willing to prove he could be something more than the man who had walked away. When he finally left the house again, he felt hollowed out but steadier. He drove back to that small town without rehearsing what he would say. All he knew was that he would not leave this time until he had looked Emily in the eye and told her that he was ready to stay, no matter how long it took her to believe him. Nathan sat in his car outside Emily's house for almost an hour before he found the courage to get out. The late afternoon was warm and quiet, a breeze rustling the leaves overhead while he watched the small front yard that already felt like the center of a world he wasn't part of. He saw the girls through the window, their curly heads bent together over a picture book, and he thought of all the times he'd told himself he didn't want this kind of life. Now he couldn't think of anything he wanted more. He knew he had no right to expect Emily to open the door, much less to forgive him. But the only thing worse than facing her anger would be turning around and never trying at all. He walked up the path slowly, his heart hammering so loudly he was sure she would hear it before he even knocked. When she appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable, he realized how much he had missed simply seeing her face. She looked tired in a way that made his chest tighten. She didn't look surprised to see him. If anything, she looked like she had been expecting this moment for a long time. She didn't speak first, so he forced himself to. His voice came out rough, too low. "I know I shouldn't be here again without calling." She didn't contradict him. He swallowed and tried to steady the shaking in his hands. I needed you to know I meant what I said. I'm sorry. For everything." Her gaze flicked past him, to the car, to the quiet street, then back to him. "You can't keep showing up thinking an apology is enough," she said finally, and her voice was calm but edged with exhaustion. "They're not old enough to understand who you are, but someday they will be. You don't get to come in and out when you feel guilty." He felt that truth settle in his bones like something heavy and unmovable. He nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "That's not why I came back. I'm not here to ask you to forgive me or to pretend this is something we can fix with a few visits. I'm here because I want to stay. Because they're mine, and you deserve someone who doesn't disappear when it gets hard." Emily looked down at her hands for a long moment. He wondered if she was remembering how he had once said almost those same words when he proposed, how he had promised he'd always be there. He hated himself for every way he had betrayed that promise. When she lifted her gaze again, her eyes were shining, but she didn't let any tears fall. "You don't know what staying looks like," she said quietly. "It's not flowers and apologies. It's diapers and fevers and nights you can't sleep because you're so tired you think you might break." "I want all of it," he said, and this time his voice didn't shake. "I know it's not my place to say that. But if you'll let me prove it, I will." The screen door was still between them, the thin mesh like a fragile barrier he didn't dare cross without permission. Inside, one of the girls called something he couldn't hear, and Emily turned her head instinctively. She didn't look back at him right away. For a moment, he thought she would send him away again, and part of him would have understood if she did. But instead, she opened the door just far enough to step outside and pulled it closed behind her. She stood on the porch, her arms crossed over her chest, her shoulders tense. "If you want to be here," she said finally, "you'll start by coming tomorrow morning. Early. You can help me with breakfast and see what your daughters' lives actually look like. If you don't show up, don't come back again." He felt something loosen in his chest he hadn't realized was clenched. It wasn't acceptance. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was a beginning. He nodded once, unable to find any words that felt right. Emily looked at him like she was trying to memorize the moment in case it never happened again. Then she turned and went inside, closing the door with a quiet click that felt almost gentle. Nathan stood there long after she was gone, the evening air cooling against his face. He knew this wasn't a victory. It was just a chance. And for the first time in years, a chance felt like enough. Nathan barely slept that night. He lay in the dark with his eyes fixed on the ceiling, feeling the nervous thrum of his pulse in every inch of his body. He couldn't remember the last time he had been afraid of something this way. Board meetings, negotiations, even public scrutiny, none of it had ever made his heart pound like this. He tried to picture what the morning would be like, but all his imagination could conjure was a blur of small details he had never learned to navigate. He had no idea how to make breakfast for toddlers or how to keep them calm when they were tired or scared. But beneath the fear, there was something steadier, a quiet certainty that this was the only place he belonged now. Just before dawn, he got up, showered, and dressed without checking the mirror. He chose simple clothes, nothing that would look like he was trying to impress her. On the drive back to Emily's house, he kept both hands tight around the steering wheel. Every traffic light felt like a test of whether he would turn around. But he didn't. He parked on the same cracked curb as the night before and sat for a moment, listening to the engine tick itself cool. He breathed in once, twice, then stepped out into the pale morning. The porch light was still on. He climbed the steps and knocked softly, wondering if she would change her mind while he stood there. But after a long minute, the door opened. Emily looked at him with the same measured expression she had worn the night before, like she was bracing herself for disappointment. She didn't smile, but she didn't tell him to leave, either. She stepped back so he could come in. The house smelled like coffee and something warm and familiar he couldn't name. He stood awkwardly in the entryway until she nodded toward the kitchen. "You can help with their cereal," she said, her voice calm but tired. He followed her down the short hallway, feeling like an intruder in a life that had kept going without him. The girls were already in their high chairs. They were smaller up close than he'd remembered, their curly hair a soft halo around round cheeks. One of them was trying to drink from a plastic cup, frowning in concentration. The other spotted him first. She blinked those impossible blue eyes and looked at him without fear, just a curious wonder that made his throat ache. Emily's hands moved quickly and quietly as she prepared their breakfast. She showed him how to pour just enough milk so it wouldn't spill everywhere, how to hold the spoon so they wouldn't grab it and fling it across the table. She didn't say much, but she didn't look away when he tried to follow her instructions. When he handed one of the girls a small piece of banana, she reached out and took it without hesitation. It felt like the smallest, most important acceptance he had ever earned. He caught Emily watching him, and for a moment their eyes held. There was no accusation there, no triumph, just the fragile recognition that this was new for both of them. After breakfast, they moved into the living room. Toys were scattered across the carpet in bright, chaotic piles. Emily sat on the floor with the girls while he hovered by the doorway, unsure whether he was allowed to join them. She didn't say anything, but she patted the rug beside her, a small gesture that made his chest tighten. He knelt, awkward and stiff in his jeans, and waited. One of the girls, the quieter of the two, crawled toward him and pressed a block into his hand. He took it carefully, trying to remember how to smile without looking as scared as he felt. Emily leaned back against the couch, her arms folded, watching him. She looked tired in a way that went beyond a sleepless night. He realized this was her every morning, alone with 2 children, with no one to help or witness any of it. The guilt settled over him again, heavier because he could see how hard she had worked to hold everything together. He stayed until mid-morning. He helped clean up toys, learned how to fasten the tiny Velcro straps on their shoes when they grew restless, listened to their babbling voices as if they were the most important sound he'd ever heard. When he finally stood to leave, Emily walked him to the door. "You showed up," she said quietly, and though her voice was neutral, he thought he heard the smallest trace of surprise. He met her gaze, trying to keep his own steady. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. He stepped outside into the bright morning feeling something he hadn't felt in years, hope so real it made his hands shake. Nathan returned the next morning and the morning after that. Each time, he stood on the porch and waited for Emily to open the door, never assuming she would, never assuming he was entitled to the smallest scrap of her patience. She always looked at him for a moment before stepping aside. At first, they barely spoke. She showed him where the bibs were, how to scoop the cereal so it didn't spill, how to dry small hands after the girls washed them in the bathroom sink. He did everything clumsily, and each time he fumbled something, he braced for her to tell him to leave. But she never did. She watched him with that same exhausted caution, as if she was waiting to see whether this time he would stay. He stayed. He came so often that the girls began to expect him. One morning, when he was late because of traffic, he found them standing by the window, their small faces pressed to the glass. When he got out of the car, one of them squealed and waved. He felt something inside him break open at the sight. No one had ever looked for him like that. He understood that they didn't fully know who he was, that to them he was just the man who kept showing up with quiet hands and careful words, but he also knew that this was the beginning of something he hadn't earned but might someday deserve. The days blurred together into a new kind of routine. He learned how to buckle them into their booster seats, how to braid the soft curls that never stayed in place, how to read the same story 3 times in a row without sighing. He learned that one of them liked her milk warm and the other cold, that one had a tiny freckle behind her ear. He learned that when they cried, it was rarely because they were hurt, but because they were tired or afraid. Every time he comforted them, he wondered if they could feel how terrified he was that he was doing everything wrong. But they never pulled away. Emily began to let him stay longer. She would leave the room sometimes, trusting him to sit on the rug with the girls and keep them occupied. He understood it was a test, not of whether he loved them, she could probably see he did, but of whether he was strong enough to show up over and over without running. One afternoon, she stood in the kitchen folding laundry while he helped the girls build a tower out of blocks. He heard her pause, heard the breath she drew before she spoke. "I used to think you were incapable of this," she said, her voice low and almost apologetic. "Of being patient. Of caring about something you couldn't control." He looked up, his hands resting lightly on the bright plastic blocks. "I used to think that too," he admitted. She didn't say anything more, but when he glanced back at her, she was watching him in a way that made his chest tighten. Not with anger. Not with suspicion. Just with something he thought might have been the first faint outline of trust. That evening, as he prepared to leave, one of the girls toddled over and lifted her arms in a silent request. He bent and picked her up, his heart hammering as she settled her head against his shoulder. She smelled like soap and graham crackers, and when she let out a small sigh, he felt the ache in his chest ease in a way he hadn't believed possible. Emily walked him to the door, her expression soft and tired. He shifted the little girl into her arms, and for a moment their hands touched. The contact was brief, but it felt like something real had passed between them, something that didn't need to be named. "You don't have to keep proving yourself every day," she said quietly, her eyes meeting his. "But I think you will anyway." He nodded because she was right. He would show up again and again, however long it took. He would learn what he should have known from the start, that love is not something you earn once and assume you get to keep. It's something you choose, over and over, even when you're afraid. When he finally walked down the steps into the evening air, he felt different. Not redeemed, not forgiven, but closer to the man he had once promised he would be. The man Emily had believed in before he let fear destroy everything. And as he looked back at the window where his daughters were waving, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could still become that man. I think this ending is powerful because it doesn't pretend that regret alone can erase years of absence and pain. What makes it moving is how honest it is. Nathan doesn't get instant redemption or a perfect reunion. Instead, he gets a hard-earned chance to try. I appreciate that Emily never makes it easy for him. She doesn't forgive him just because he finally showed up, she sets boundaries and tests his commitment, because that's what real healing requires. Her willingness to let him back into their lives, little by little, feels believable and respectful to what she endured alone. What I find most beautiful is how the story shows that love isn't a moment, it's a decision you have to keep making. Nathan doesn't just have to apologize once, he has to prove, every day, that he can be the father he failed to be. That small, hopeful progress, two little girls learning to trust, a woman learning to let go of her hurt, a man learning to be humble, is more satisfying than any dramatic reunion. To me, the ending isn't about erasing the past. It's about choosing to build something better in spite of it, and that's what makes it so quietly powerful.